Healing complex PTSD, resolving trauma.
Engaging with reality on a deep psyche level. So from the perspective of deep psyche, that is not from the perspective of ego, not from the perspective of rational material, but deep psyche, which is inclusive of the unconscious, the symbolic, the archetypal patterns. So deep psyche recognizes the patterns of existence, not just the concrete aspect of it, not just the this is this and that is this and cause and effect kind of stuff. So deep psyche, which is where we're coming from when we're in a psychologically minded perspective, holds the possibility of a deeper pattern emerging, or invisible threads being woven with, right?
You know, I've been working with trauma since 1991 in kind of the caveman era of the trauma treatment world, when literally we were inventing the wheel. We didn't know how to treat trauma. Our best guess was that we should use the talking cure, because that's what we knew back in the 90s. And but we kept running into the fact that for traumatized individuals, talking about what happened didn't always lead to resolution or relief. It often led to reliving. Yehuda said something at a conference probably 15 years ago that stopped the audience. You know, you could hear the hush in the room. She was standing in front of probably 600-700 people at Bessel van der Kolk's annual trauma conference. And she looked out at the audience and she said, "What does it mean to treat a trauma? Does it mean that we treat the events, or does it mean that we treat the shame, the sense of defectiveness, the hopelessness?" And there was this hush when she said, "Does it mean treating the events?" I think the hush was everyone in the room saying, "Oh my God, we've been treating the events. We haven't," assuming the low self-esteem, the shame, the loneliness, the sense of defectiveness would resolve if we helped people to treat the events. So I'm always looking for approaches that don't treat events. EMDR actually is an approach that doesn't treat the events, because it asks the therapist to break the event down into an image, into beliefs, into feelings and body sensation. The somatic therapies, sensory motor psychotherapy in particular, has also brought a very new approach to trauma treatment. It too treats the body sensations, the emotions, the beliefs, and movement impulses, rather than events. And then I've always been a long-time fan of internal family systems, and have often integrated sensory motor psychotherapy and internal family systems. And then I would guess probably 5 years ago, I was thinking one day about this word healing. We talk about trauma healing. And I thought to myself, well, healing is not what people feel when they process traumatic memories. They feel exhausted. They may feel a sense of relief, I got through it, but they don't feel healed. And then I had an epiphany. I thought, no, the moment that we feel healed is the moment that we accept ourselves. We forgive ourselves.
Yes.
we extend compassion to ourselves. And even, God forbid, love ourselves. And then I began to think, okay, how do we help our patients to get there? How do we help them get to that place where they feel a kind of loving attunement with themselves? You know, so let's say 5 years ago would have been roughly 2013. I had spent my entire career since the early 90s helping people to reclaim their lives, to function better, to be able to have healthy relationships, despite the trauma. And when I had this epiphany, it was going a step further. It was saying, because I heard from so many of my long-term patients, they said, you know, I have a life now. I have meaningful relationships. I have work that I love, but I don't enjoy it. I don't feel a sense of nourishment or satisfaction or joy. And so I was thinking, okay, we've got to restore people's lives to them. And then we have to restore them to themselves so that they feel a sense of what's the word? So they feel a sense of self-compassion, self-acceptance, and self-love that mimics the experience of secure attachment in childhood.
And here is where the red healer comes in. Very clearly, for me, this has been such a game changer. It has resolved so much trauma, but not only that, even on the physical plane, so much healing has happened. It's just amazing. I have been investigating trauma and PTSD, CPTSD for quite a while. These are mainly online courses from the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. So, what happens in the brain during a potentially traumatic event? Traumatic experiences change the way our brain functions and how we see the world. Research shows that when we are traumatized, our central nervous system is set to cope with our past traumatic event rather than what is happening in the present. When you've been traumatized, your body becomes stuck in fear and terror. Dr. van der Kolk offers us effective ways to overcome the suffering and refocus our mind and re-regulate our body. We discover how the brain is affected when we are traumatized, helping us to develop a deeper understanding of the nature of trauma. These courses are really very educational and I loved the approach, and the ones by Dr. Janina Fischer, I just love her approach and her way of explaining trauma. Trauma can alienate us from ourselves, and how an important part of trauma recovery is coming to know all parts of ourselves. What is most likely to help a trauma survivor feel for themselves is acknowledging that they have contended with a lot through their trauma and experiences. Understanding ourselves as trauma survivors and considering the various sides of ourselves that it took to anticipate, protect, and be prepared for threat and or danger. Every distressing thought feeling, or physical reaction should be viewed as a communication from a specific part of ourselves. Trauma survivors with fragmented or personality splitting are encouraged to identify the age of their parts, because knowing the age allows the survivor to feel for the child. Neural circuitry is more active to trauma triggers, and that's why we are often hypersensitive to these triggers. When triggered by trauma, our brain goes into hyper alert, and part of our thinking is shut down. Dr. Fisher looks at the triggers that can lead to relapse and offers skills for relief. So yesterday I came across this interesting video, The Inked Shrink. It's very interesting, and yes, I definitely am this type. Absent mother, dominant father.
Something that I think we'll all have experience with, which is a Disney movie, The Little Mermaid, because who doesn't love some Ariel, right? So on the surface, rational, normal perspective, The Little Mermaid is a story about an adolescent mermaid with an austere, stern father that doesn't want her to live her life, and so she has this kind of rich fantasy life that is comprised of like all of the like things that she collects that means something to her about the world that she cannot access because she's living this kind of cloistered existence because her strict father, right? And there's no mother to be seen, and she's got these sisters, and she's got this amazing singing voice, and all that she wants, like her big conflict, is that she wants legs to live on land, right? Great story, fun drama, good characters. She's got her little crab friend, lobster friend. Is Sebastian a crab or a lobster? Got him hanging out, supporting her. She's got her music. She's got her like other weird fishy friends, right? And her collection of things. Look at this stuff, isn't it neat, right? And she falls in love with a prince, or she meets this, she meets Ursula, right? God, I haven't watched the movie in a really long time. Probably should have done that. Anyway, Ursula is this octopus woman, this like ferocious villain character that wants Ariel's voice, right? And she says, I'll trade you your voice, and in exchange, I'll give you legs. And so Ariel gets her dream. She gets to go walk on dry land and be part of that world, right? And Ursula gets Ariel's very enchanting, charming, magical singing voice. And Ariel, while on land, meets this prince, falls in love with him. He falls in love with her. It's a little weird because she can't talk, but whatever. We won't get into that yet. And the drama ensues where like she falls in love with him, or he falls in love with her because of her voice. Then Ursula takes the voice, right? Yeah, that's what happens. And then the prince gets confused because he hears Ursula's like avatar double singing and thinks it's Ariel. And then Ariel's gonna lose her man. And there's like this whole thing with the eels, drama with the eels. Anyway, I'm not gonna get too into details because obviously I forget them. But let's look at this from a psychological perspective, okay? Let's interpret this from a psychological perspective, where Ariel is, let's say, the dream ego, or the autonomous identity, that Ariel is the protagonist, right? She's motherless. She has a very extreme father. So in psychological language, we would say that she has an absent mother complex, or a negative mother complex. That is, she's dealing with emotions and memories, inner experiences that equate mother with something negative. So there's the absence of mother creates a negative in her, right? And she's also got a negative father complex, in that her father is overbearing too harsh, too stern, emotionally unavailable. So this creates in her another kind of inner impression, right? Her negative father complex is an inner impression. So we start with the psyche or the psychology of somebody who has both a negative mother complex and a negative father complex. That manifests, and we see this in her, in how much energy, how much libido, how much numinosity she puts into all of her material objects, right? That she's got all of this untapped potential that she can't access, and she, instead of, because she can't access it, she's outsourcing it, she's projecting it, right, onto material things, that these things contain the creativity and the life that she cannot live yet. These things contain her unlived life, which is what happens when we project our unrealized selves onto other things. Those things then become the houses for our unlived lives. Those things can also be people, right? This is the idea of shadow. So the reason that this is significant is because the mother, if we have a good enough mother complex, right, we learn a relationship to life that is nourishing and soulful, that has some connection to body and place and groundedness and presence and vitality, right? That this is the sort of feminine principle, is this like life wants to live thing. Without that, she doesn't have the ability to tap into that impulse in herself. So she's projecting it onto these things. These things then represent the life that she cannot live. The negative father complex often manifests in an individual as sort of hyper ambition and an overthinkingness. And that overthinkingness can very quickly spin into fantasizing, just a sort of perpetual fantasy about someday this will come, someday this will be my life, and this visualization of what could be. So it's a very mental thing with no action, right? Because there's not enough love present to help manifest or act on that masculine urge to do. Without the doing part of the vision, it just remains stuck in the space, mental space, right? Which is the realm of the masculine. So this is sort of the psyche of Ariel, is representing this negative father complex and absent mother complex, or negative mother complex. Which then the negative mother complex, to continue with the interpretation of that, shows up in Ursula. So Ursula, we could almost say, isn't actually a character. She's one of Ariel's inner figures. And this is the kind of penultimate or ultimate interpretation of this myth, of this fairy tale, Disney movie, whatever, same thing, is that the negative mother complex, when one doesn't have that self mirrored back to them and held with love and care growing up, they lose.
Yeah, that's me.
There's something that gets internalized that says you don't deserve life. It's very harsh sounding, but that's the sort of internal tape that plays, is
Totally, yes.
is you're not deserving of life, you're unworthy to live, right? So this idea of deservingness and worthiness is really something that we learn from the way that our mother reflects back to us our own creativity and our own vitality and our own impulse. Without that reflection back, we learn that our impulses, our lust to create, our lust for life is not valued. It's unworthy. So that interpretation or that messaging gets interpreted in the body on an unconscious level as you don't deserve to live, right? So what that ends up being is that any time in adulthood we have the urge to create, that inner figure, that negative mother complex kind of swoops in and takes that creative impulse and robs us of the ability to act on it. Says, nope, no joy for you, no love for you, no spirit for you, no creativity for you, right? And we get kind of stuck in a self-sabotaging loop where we feel all of our attempts to live more fully our lives, that is, to embrace more our engagement with the world, which is the feminine, this relational dynamic, get thwarted by our lack of inner resources, or by the negative mother complex. So this is manifested in The Little Mermaid as Ursula stealing Ariel's voice, right?
My voice?
You've got it, sweet cakes. No more talking, singing, zip.
But without my voice, how can I...
What's wrong? What is it? You can't speak?
Especially a woman with a negative mother complex, is that she feels her voice has been robbed.
Amazing.
That any impulse to use the gifts that she has innately been given gets taken by some inner figure who looks a lot like Ursula, right?
This is so amazing what she says, and I can totally relate. So as a kid, I had selective mutism. I was only okay reading from a book in front of others. But answering questions asked by the teacher in front of class, absolutely impossible. I just went mute, and my heart would be beating in my chest, and I just couldn't. I could not say a word. Yeah. And this was going on for a very long time. And actually only recently I truly got this back. But I still have an issue when I'm nervous, when I'm anxious, then I get shy, and then I still don't talk that fluently. There's still an issue, but I'm working on it with the red healer, and it's getting there. It's a work in progress, but definitely something is happening.
She's this kind of tentacle-y, all-consuming, super possessive, like bad bitch that will just steal any impulse to new life.
You see, this is exactly where the red healer comes in. It makes me aware of these parts that are dissociated, and one becomes aware of what's going on, and then you can actually integrate it. And you have to do it in baby steps. And that's the microdosing protocol. You just go on and on. And your different parts that got dissociated through trauma, they get reintegrated with the red healer. Trust the process.
And that when we're dealing with libido, we're always in the realm of dealing with both conscious and unconscious psyche, that libido moves, that there's plenty of energy to use, plenty of libido to use when there's alignment between conscious and unconscious, or when there's a good gradient. So in order to kind of talk about this a bit more, I'm going to read a bit from Collected Work 7, if you'll indulge me just a little bit. In paragraph 75, he says, fate behaves irrationally, and the energy of life inconveniently demands a gradient agreeable to itself. Otherwise, it simply gets dammed up and turns destructive. So what he's talking about is this other Jungian idea, which I think is so poignant and wise, that that the unconscious, that when there's an unconscious aspect of self, an unrealized aspect of self that we haven't brought to the surface, it's going to show up in our lives as some sort of external confrontation. It's going to be an event or a person or a song on the radio or something that kind of slams into us in any big or small way and feels kind of fated or destined, like, oh, I needed to be here, oh, I needed to run into this, oh, I needed that car accident. Like, there's something about it that feels quite like preordained almost. And Jung talks about that as being a resonance or like something in the unconscious that was made external or is external because it was not made conscious internally. So when he says that fate behaves irrationally and the energy of life inconveniently demands a gradient agreeable to itself, what he's talking about is that the life that wants to live through us it demands a gradient that is agreeable. So when we run out of libido, when we run out of psychic energy for something, and start operating in overdrive or on willpower alone, like that there's no kind of inner resources, and you'll know this because you're exhausted, right? You have no energy. There's no creativity. There's no actual like wellspring or tap that you can hit that like replenishes you, right? You're just operating on will alone, which is exhausting and doesn't last for very long, and is potentially incredibly psychically hazardous, right? That life demands a gradient agreeable to itself. So no matter what you consciously, willfully want or desire or are working with, unless that there is like an unconscious correlate, there's going to be a misalignment. And life will create the circumstances for you to discover that misalignment inconveniently, so he says that the energy gets dammed up and turns destructive. So this is often what happens, and this is often what people come into therapy for, is that some aspect of their life has become either dammed up, drained, there's no energy left, there's no libido left, or it's become destructive. Like we see compulsions and addictions and burnout and violence and any other number of destructive things.
And this is going on in your system, and then you are reacting to your environment. Dr. Robert Scaer says about triggers, which you can also call cues, triggering of the trauma through either a conscious or unconscious memory. And many times it's rather unconscious. And the reason I say it's a corruption of memory is that when one experiences the emergence of those memory patterns from an old trauma, it's as if they're real and in the present moment, like a flashback. And those are hard to deal with. And that's the corruption of memory. Suddenly, your present moment is occupied by a past event that, in fact, is over. because the chemicals that go on in the body have to do with the various neurotransmitters that trigger arousal and also trigger dissociation, which is what we perceive when we're in the freeze response as part of the fight, flight, freeze. The fight, flight, freeze response, of course, is critical in understanding trauma because it is a state that is replicated in many ways in all of the symptoms of trauma later on. So, what we need to work on is removing the trigger. If there are no triggers that remind you of your previous trauma, unconsciously or consciously, then no reaction. I did an earlier video when I talked about this noise that triggered anger in me, and I never knew why. Thanks to working with the Red Healer, I have resolved a lot of trauma. And this one out of the blue, because I was in a parasympathetic state, relaxed. Actually, a trauma memory came up and showed me the original trigger that was coupled negatively to that trauma. And only because I could remember, I could finally integrate it. And now, this particular noise does not trigger me anymore to such an extent. It's no longer coupled to this memory. So, what are triggers? They are reminders of past events. They often are unrecognized. They come in all shapes and sizes. They elicit threat responses and symptoms. They elicit flares in chronic diseases. Flares represent fight, flight, freeze responses. They are based on unresolved trauma. They may not be dangerous or stressful. They can be identified, and healing triggers can help flares. Healing trauma helps chronic illness. And it's not behavioral. It's not cognitive. You are reacting to things in your environment that remind you of the previous trauma. And therefore also all the victim blaming. I have a real issue with that for this reason. However, I have found a way to dissolve trauma. It actually reminds me of how the shamans call it, to integrate lost parts. It is soul retrieval, and you become more whole.
What has always made sense to me, maybe because of those early years in the trauma field, was to integrate approaches rather than to use an approach with every single patient. I like the idea of bringing models together.
Yeah.
And I've always had a problem with the central idea in trauma treatment, which has been forever and ever. It has been this idea that in order to be free of the past, the patient has to go back into the trauma. And that's disturbed me, I think, just kind of in terms of the fairness. It just never seemed fair that the treatment for unbearable, intolerable experiences should be to relive and feel again unbearable emotions. So I've been exploring all through my career, how do we find gentle, nourishing forms of trauma treatment rather than intense and painful forms of trauma treatment?
Which is where the red healer comes in. This is very gentle. You go at your own pace. It's indirect. What needs to come up comes up, but at the proper time. And therefore, you also no longer get triggered. Once the trauma memories are erased. If you want to learn more about this, I can highly recommend Dr. Robert Scaer's podcast. He has a way explaining trauma I have not heard from anyone in that way. And he defines trauma as a threat to life. And of course that can be something much less than one would think, as opposed to rape, warfare, incest, or horrible sources of things we acknowledge as trauma. It may be any situation where one is faced with a threat to one's well-being, one's survival. And that can be like losing a job, and a situation that is combined with a state of helplessness, where one has no control over that event. And that's basically the definition of trauma. There you go. The ways to define trauma, or to define what it is and what it does. Trauma is a corruption of memory. It doesn't just mean things you can imagine and bring up to consciousness, but also, and most importantly perhaps, all of the sensory experiences surrounding that event. Pain, stimulation of the vestibular system, like in a whiplash where your head goes back and forth. Touch, body movement, patterns, any sensory input at the time of the trauma. If a freeze occurs, you store that in what is called procedural memory. Procedural memory is unconscious, implicit, non-declarative, as opposed to declarative or explicit memory, like trying to study or memorize a body of facts. It is totally unconscious. In fact, the somatic part is only experienced if it occurs with the somatic sensations being replicated. That's the important trauma work you can do in a somatic way. That accompanied that trauma, whether it's pain or dizziness or stretching of a limb. they tend to be resurrected with any subtle environmental cues reminiscent of the trauma. However, with the red healer, you can finally resolve trauma. And your brain gets totally rewired. It's magic. That's the only way I can describe it. And therefore, I am so grateful that I can work through this, because I had no access to any trauma therapist. I cannot afford it. Insurance doesn't pay. So, I have no other way. And I was quite desperate. And therefore, I was open to try alternative methods. And I am so glad I did. Now I would say that's the best way to heal trauma, because it is so gentle. When it is gone, it is gone. There is no residue, or rather the negative coupling with the thing that triggers you, like noises or scents or people that look similar, like the abuser, stuff like that. They will no longer trigger you. So working with Amanita muscaria is more organic and gets to the heart of things. It is indirect, it's not victim blaming, no guilt tripping. The red healer goes in and resolves the trauma. And that is the goal.
Is the claiming of her missing piece. So it's representative of an inner marriage. It's representative of the alchemical transition that she has gone through in reclaiming her missing piece, in this case, her voice, right? She's reclaimed her voice, which is deeply metaphorical. I'm sure that that's not lost on you. She's reclaimed her voice, her ability to speak up for herself, her ability to create, her ability to be authentic, to communicate, and sing, which is her expression of very true and unique to her, right? And in reclaiming that, she's been able to enter into a love relationship which is symbolic of or representative of the inner marriage that she has now between masculine and feminine, between what was missing, which is this sort of healthy relationship to father and mother, the inner other, right, and herself, the inner other, and she can now cohabitate successfully, giving her greater access to all of her wholeness instead of living this divided, voiceless life. So there's a little psychological mindedness for you on this lovely Saturday.
Which for me is the ultimate goal. This is belonging, acceptance. This is Otala. The simple recognition of my truth and gaining back my unlost instinct